right, let's continue applying CSS to our document here. So what I'm going to do, this is exercise 2, and I'm just going to preview it into a browser as such. And, it's pretty similar kind of setup to what we had in exercise 1. So there's like a heading 1, and there's a couple of paragraphs, unordered list, a couple of hyperlinks. And so I'm going to go inside here, and I'm going to find the style section. Remember, this is where we write our CSS. Style section should be inside of the head section. And I'm going to go in here and let's do H1 is my selector, the thing I want to affect. I want to change this from black to a different color, like red maybe. So my selector, property, value, semicolon. So I'm selecting the H1. I'm changing the text color to red. And let's go back. All right, so it does that. Let's talk about some other properties that we can, other CSS or cascading style properties that we can play around with. So this is dealing with my text color. But what if I wanted to change the size of my font? So typically, your font size is actually dictated by the browser itself. So if you go to Chrome or Firefox or whatever, usually there's an appearance section. And see how it actually says font size here under appearance? And if I was to change this, you can see that my text is either growing or shrinking, right? So I could use, the browser itself could set the size, but actually I want to set the size. I want to set a design and I want to set how large my text is going to be. So we have a CSS property for that. It's called font size. And the value is whatever size I would like my text to be. Okay. So this kind of brings up this idea of measurements. Okay, in CSS, we can actually use different measurements for different things. There's a lot of ways to measure the same item. So for instance, you can't see the desk that I'm sitting in front of, but if I wanted to measure my desk, I could measure it using feet or yards or centimeters or millimeters, right? There's all these different measurements, right? And, if it was feet, I'd have like, I don't know, probably 2.5 feet, or if it's inches, it's like 48 inches or whatever. So it's a different number depending on which measurement, but I can measure it in different ways. And in the same way, we can measure our text in different ways. So I'm going to start with points, or PT. Points is the sort of the default way most text is measured. You've been using points your whole life, you probably just never noticed. So when you're in Microsoft Word and you set your text to 12, that's 12 points. The way it works is that basically 1 inch is equal to 72 points. So in other words, if you were to print a page that's at 12 points, divided by 72 would be 0.166, repeating. Or in other words, if you measured your text from the base to the top, it would be 1/6 of an inch tall, or 0.166 inches tall. Okay. So I'm going to set mine to 20 points. And if I go back, you can see it changed the size here. And make this 40 points. And my text get larger. 60 points. Okay. I could use other measurement systems as well. I'm going to use 60 pixels, okay? We've talked about pixels before when it came to raster images. Pixels are just the way we measure things digitally. A pixel is a little bit smaller. It's about 3/4 the size of a point. So 60 pixels will actually be smaller than 60 points. So if I save and refresh, it gets a little bit smaller. I could do inches. I could do like 1 inch. 1 inch is actually very large. I could do 1 centimeter. A centimeter is smaller than an inch, so it should lower it, So there's all these different ways that we could do it. We could even use what's called a relative system. So 72 points or 20 points or 25 points, that's what we call a finite system. 25 points is always 25 points. It's never bigger or smaller. What we could use is a relative system where we do percentages. So for instance, if I was to do 200%, what that means is whatever the default size of this is, make it twice that size, or 200%. So if I hit save, this is twice the size in the default size. If you set it to 100%, that's like its normal size. And then if I set this to 50%, this is like half of the normal size. Okay, so this is another way you could do it, where you're using a relative measurement as opposed to a finite measurement. I'm just going to use points for now. I have a feeling most of you probably use points because that's probably what you're familiar with. Okay. Next thing is the type of the typeface we're using. Okay, once again, this is typically set in your appearance. For instance, I'm going to go to Customize Fonts. So actually here, my default in my browser is Helvetica. So at any time you can see that it's defaulting to Helvetica. If I switch this to something else, like say Times New Roman, which is a serif typeface, don't worry if you don't know what those are, we'll talk about it slightly. You can see how the default typeface changed to Times New Roman. Okay, so in other words, by default, your typeface is based on your browser. Okay, every browser has a default typeface. Most of the time, it's probably going to be something like Times New Roman or Helvetica. But I could actually set that here in the CSS. So we have a typeface, or we have a property called font family. What font family allows you to do is to state what typeface you would like to use for your browser. So I want to change this from Helvetica to a typeface called Courier. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to type in Courier. I'm going to hit save. So I wrote it out the way we normally do. I'm going to refresh, and you can see that this is now changed. It's changed to Courier, even though the rest of it is actually still following Helvetica. Let's go back to my code a little bit, and you might notice that this looks a little different than the other ones. For instance, this is capitalized, and I never capitalized anything else. The other thing is also this went inside quotation marks, whereas these other ones like red or 30 points and such didn't go in quotation marks. So why is this one different? The answer is that when you say something like red or 12 points or something, that's just a general measurement. This is actually a reference to a file. Without getting too deep into it, every computer has a set of fonts that are installed in the computer. So I'm actually going to quickly go to my fonts. Okay, so you see I have a bunch of fonts here. These are font files that make my typefaces. So this is actually a reference to a particular file. That's why it has to be capitalized. It's also why it goes in quotation marks, okay? Because it's the name of a particular file, okay? It's not just like a term like blue or orange or 15 or something like that. So that's why this happens, okay? One more thing I wanted to talk about is, let's go back and talk about how the internet works, okay? So here's my computer, right? And if we know about how the internet works, the internet is a bunch of computers that talk to each other, right? Let's say that I'm going to download a file from this computer. This is the server, okay? So my computer connects to the server, and it downloads files. What does it download? Well, it downloads things like HTML files. It downloads images, like we've talked about, like JPEGs and PNGs and such. It also downloads a CSS file, just like what we've been working on. Here's what it doesn't download. So it doesn't download fonts. So for instance, when I say something like this, font family Courier, this is more of like a suggestion as opposed to saying it is going to be Courier. So in other words, what this relies on is that the person viewing the web page has to have that typeface. So in other words, like if I download the CSS, my computer has to have the Courier font installed. If it doesn't, this isn't going to work, okay? Because I don't download the fonts with it. If you've done anything with installing fonts and other graphic design programs, you would know a little bit about how this works. So the problem with this is what happens if someone doesn't have Courier? What would happen? And the answer is currently, this would basically get ignored because if they don't have Courier, that's kind of it. It would just go back to whatever the default font is for the browser. But I would like to have sort of a backup, which is to say, okay, in case they don't have Courier, I want there to be a backup font that I want them to try to use. So we call this a cascading font list. Okay. So the idea is I might do something like this. So let's hypothetically say I want them to use Helvetica. Let's say they don't have Helvetica. I might put in Arial. Arial is very similar to Helvetica in terms of the style. So I can list multiple as long as I use commas. Just like with the others, I would put them in quotation marks and capitalize them. I don't know. Let's say they don't have Arial. I don't know. What's another good one? I'm trying to think of like a good sans serif typeface. I don't know. I can't even think of one, to be perfectly honest, that most people would have. Maybe like Monaco or something. And I could list as many as I want. There's no limit. After a couple of them, you may want to just... So what this basically says is like, use Helvetica. If they don't have Helvetica, use Arial. If they don't have Arial, use Monaco. You can also just put in a style of typefaces. If you know a little bit about typography, you know that there's styles of typefaces like serif and sans serif and fantasy and stuff like that. So I can just say, instead of saying a particular typeface name, I could say something just like sans serif. What this means is that instead of using Helvetica or Arial, just use whatever the default sans serif font is. Because it's a category and not the name of a particular typeface, you don't have to put it in quotation marks and you don't have to capitalize it. Okay. So I'm going to save and go back, and it should work because I already know I have Helvetica on the system here. But just in case I didn't, this would go into Arial and then, Monaco and then just whatever the default sans serif is. So maybe I'll go to this paragraph. Let's try something like this. Paragraph, color, green. And let's do font size. Let's make it a little smaller, 16 points. So it's a little bigger than it was, but smaller than this. And I don't know, just for fun, let's make it... I'm going to do font family. Let's make it Times New Roman. Times New Roman is a serif typeface. We'll talk more about typography later, but serif just means it has little curly Q's on it. There's a similar one called Tahoma. I'll have that be the backup, and then I'll just use serif as the category type. So this is the one I want. If they don't have that, this is kind of like asking this to be the backup, and then if they don't have either of these, this is just a category type. Okay. All right, why don't you guys try that out? Try playing around with different fonts. Try different sizes. Try using points, pixels, inches, and try playing around with different fonts. Okay.